Okay, is that better?
Perfect.
All right. So it's going to be a little bit like a trip down a black hole this evening. From the last session, the little map tour that we took, we know that we are entering into a time when things are very intensely fragmented in the Armenian landscape. It's not that Armenian territory had never been divided up before. It had been split more than once between the direct rule of Persia and Byzantium, the east and the west, respectively. But this time, the fragmentation is going to be much intensified, in part by the permanent and seemingly irregular settlements of non-Armenians in the Armenian highland. There are going to be Muslim populations in these areas, and the fluctuating relations between these groups and their Armenian neighbors is going to make this a very complicated scene. Last time, we also talked about the death of Catholicos Sahak, who opens the 8th century, and whose posthumous negotiations with the Arab general Muhammad caused there to be a period of peace until about the middle to end of the first decade of the 8th century. And the peace began very beautifully. The Catholicos' body was brought back from Haran in Syria to Ervine with honor for burial. Things are good. Sahak's successor, the Catholicos Yeria I, was from the little area that you can see on the map. There's a little purple circle right above the head of the goat that Lake Van looks like. So if you think of it as a goat with the tail towards the west and the head towards the east, right above the ear is a little town called Argesh. This is where he came from. And he began his career in the church as the clan bishop of an area not that far away. If you look a little bit to the left, you see there's a purple and green and blue kind of outline with the cross-hatching on it. That's the province, more or less, of Buznunik, a region of the bigger Armenian province called Duruperan. So he doesn't go very far from home for this early part of his career. It also means that he's from a section of Armenian territory that had early experience with the coming of Islam. And so it makes sense that as Catholicos, part of his policy was to find a way to live together with the Muslim authorities, as his predecessor Sahak had done. But as it happened, Yeria's 13 years of reign coincided with the reign of 3 caliphs. So over this relatively short time period, there are 3 rulers with whom he has to do. The first one, Abd al-Malik, was still going to reign for a couple of years after the death of Sahak. So Yeria gets to be right there at the end of his time in power. And then the shorter reigns of 2 of his 14 sons, Al-Walid I and Suleiman. And as you can see, Al-Walid I reigns for a decade. That's kind of a respectable time period, but then Suleiman is more problematic. And it's interesting in Yeria's case that his death coincides with that of the Caliph. And as we'll see, it also coincides with the end of a reign in Byzantium. So it must have been one of those years when everybody under the same stars is having similar life crises. We know Abd al-Malik primarily from his activities not in Armenia. Here you can see a gold dinar from his time period. It's a little unusual because it has on it a depiction of himself, which, as we know, is not going to be the case for very long in Islam. They're going to turn away from the idea of having images of living things, people especially, on their coinage. We know him primarily for his work in building this. Something that's familiar, I'm sure, to everyone who's ever traveled to Jerusalem, people who've been in or have come from the Middle East, the Dome of the Rock, with its interior similarities to the ambulatory structure of the Holy Sepulchre Church, for those of you who have been there. It's very impressive spaces. Here you see the rotunda with the walkway around the sacred rock that is the focal point of this structure. It's a building on which no expense was spared in terms of its decoration. As you can see, the ornamentation is extreme and very beautiful. And when you walk around it, you have the feeling that you are ambulating through a garden with light, the sky above, and incredibly intricate patterning in the ceilings. Again, a place where no one is actually going to be getting up there to look at it. Nonetheless, the presence of the sacred in this space is clearly shown. Every inch of it is covered in these fantastic decorations. Abd al-Malik's generation was the first one to be able to take Islamic dominance of the world for granted. And he memorialized that dominance, not only by beautifying and memorializing and making into a shrine for veneration, a major Islamic holy site, but also by minting coins that were equal to those in the Sasanian and Byzantine empires, the Sasanians who the Muslims had defeated and the Byzantines whom they hoped to defeat. And having begun with this incredible building program and his piety and his desire for imperial equality, Abd al-Malik's son, Walid, 4 of his sons became caliphs after him, continued his father's work in a very similar vein. So as you see, there's not much focus on what's happening in Armenia. Walid removed the figural depictions from Islamic coinage, thus distinguishing them from those of the competing powers like the Byzantines. He also built this. Again, for you who are from Jerusalem, familiar with the area, you know the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And by doing this, putting it across from his father's Dome of the Rock, he created the Islamic worship complex that we know today. Dome of the Rock at one end, Al-Aqsa Mosque at the other. Walid also went on to build the Muhammad Mosque in the Islamic holy city of Medina, as well as the great mosque in Damascus, which was built to replace the Byzantine Church of St. John the Baptist there. So father and son are both architects of the pious, building spaces for the holy. But it wasn't just the holy that required space to be defined for it. From the same time period come secular buildings like this one. This is the Qusayr Ammar in Jordan. And if you go into it, it looks fairly unprepossessing from the outside, but when you go into it, you see that it's completely frescoed. And from the same time period is also a pair of structures. One of them is called the Sharqi and one the Gharbi, but they're both Kasrat al-Hayr. And when you look at the solidity and the imposing size and the splendor of these structures, no one would have an inkling looking at these that within 30 years, the dynasty that built them would have disintegrated into chaos and been replaced. Likewise, when Walid's brother and successor Suleiman had his generals attack Byzantium, the capital city of their rival empire, an event that's shown here in a manuscript illumination from Bulgaria. Again, it's a strong sign of power and aggressive government. And because it was so spectacular, in a way it masked the fact that Islamic expansion elsewhere, and in fact here also in Byzantium, had come to a halt. And that after the failure of this attempt to attack the capital city of the Byzantine Empire, plans to take over Byzantium and add it to the empire of Islam were effectively shelved. But these things are in the future. And so just looking at it at the time, looking at an Islamic state that could build structures on the scale that it did, with the splendor that it did, that was memorializing its holy shrines at a great rate, that was capable of attacking Byzantium by sea and by land, you can see why Katolikos Yeria would not want to quarrel with this government. In addition, throughout the 13 years of his reign, and we will come back to this towards the end of the class, the Byzantine Empire was living through what were known as the 20 years of anarchy. And you can see the people who presided over this anarchy in the pictures. The throne is held in these 20 years by 6 emperors in quick and violent succession to one another. So there really was not much to be gained by aligning oneself with the Byzantine Empire at this point. And as you can see, the 20 years of anarchy come to an end the same year that Yeria died. So of course he could again not foresee that almost a century of stability was lying just over the horizon, just a few months after his own death. Things would change completely. But we never have the benefit of being able to see ahead in that way. We live with whatever it is that we have in front of us. And so for Yeria, it was a tough situation. The treaty that had been brokered by Katolikos Sahak was going to come to an end in the 5th year of Yeria's own reign. And he had no idea how that would play out exactly, but he had an inkling that the playing out of it would not be good. Because while he and everyone else was pondering the unclarity of where and to whom they might turn, who they might depend on, where the best alliances were going to be made, if any, a segment of the Bagratuni family's nobility chose, in spite of everything, to align themselves with the Byzantines, in spite of the chaotic situation. I think they were persuaded, partly by the fact that Byzantium, even chaotic, is still a Christian power, and thus has more in common perhaps with Armenia. The relationship between the two states is an old one, not always happy, but definitely has stood the test of time. And Justinian II returned to the throne a second time. He was a comeback master. And even without his nose, people still preferred him over other options. As we mentioned last time, his nose was sliced off to prevent him from taking power again. However, he had a silver one made as a replacement. And people chose to overlook the fact, although it got a nickname from it, referring to that problem. And even though he had lost his nose, his territorial dreams were still very much intact. He still had the vision of extending the Byzantine Empire to its greatest extent once again. And it may be that the Bagratids were impressed enough with his power and his vision to support an incursion into Armenian territory by him, trying to recoup Armenian land for Byzantium from the Arabs. This was not a wise move. When the Arabs had defeated the Byzantines, the nobility who had led this ill-fated attempt, and we won't go into it, but there were also some unfortunate actions that the Bagratid troops took against Arab military who surrendered to them, things that should not happen in a time of war. These nobility, realizing that things would not be good for them, fled over the border, leaving very angry Islamic troops to take revenge on other people instead. And so Revont, the historian, tells us how Armenian nobility were called, as if for an important discussion, to Nakhichevan. And when they arrived there, they were taken to church, which seems like a polite thing of Muslim rulers to do before convening a meeting, but it was not. The nobility were told that their families needed to ransom them at a high price. They were given time to send messengers to home to see what money could be collected. When money had been handed over to the Muslim authorities for the release of these men, the churches were locked and set on fire with them inside. After this terrible punishment, taxation on Armenian territories also went up. Nakharars who were not present for this event were imprisoned until payment. When they made their own payments, they were offered conversion or hanging. Most of them chose hanging. Some of them were carried off into Damascus. And in fact, the measures that were taken against Armenia's elites were so draconian that the caliphate recalled the governor and replaced him with a man named Abdulaziz, who was tasked with rebuilding the city of Ervine. And this is kind of a funny story. You know how sometimes your life brings you back to a place where you were before that you thought you would never see again? And there you are suddenly. The same thing happened to him. And Revont, the historian, tells the story in Abdulaziz's own words. When he receives his assignment, he comes to Armenia, he enters the city. He's a very kind of gregarious, outgoing, nice guy. And he's sitting around talking with some of the local notables. And he says, you know, it just is really funny how fate does these things. When I was 12, mind you, this guy is in the military at the age of 12. We will come back to other things that we find a little strange in the West concerning people of very young ages. Anyway, he was 12, he was a skinny young kid. And so he had a red towel and he was pushed up a drain pipe so that he got into the city of Ervine. And nobody looks twice, a skinny kid walking along the streets. He found his way up to the top of the rampart around Ervine. You can kind of see the outline of it there on the picture on the right. And when he got up on the wall, what he did was to wave his red towel and say, you know, to the troops outside, come on, come on. And they, thinking that people were already in the city from the army, really ramped up the attack and took the city. There was nobody inside except him from the Arab side. So he felt that he was responsible in a way, because after his little brave act, the city was destroyed. And he felt responsible for the fact that it had been. And so he said to the notables, look what happens. Try not to destroy things because you may have to go back and pick it up again, just like I'm having to do. I was responsible for its destruction, and now I'm responsible for its rebuilding. And amid the architectural remains of Ervine, which have been the site of an archaeological dig, this is part of the church. It's quite a massive site. In and among the remains are quite exquisite sculptures dating from this time period, and inscriptions like this one in Arabic that attest to the period of Muslim control in the city. And in case you are interested in this kind of thing, Ervine has its own Facebook page where you can go and find more interesting tidbits about it. There are not very many individual stories from this time period. Abdelaziz's is one of them. But there are a few, and the ones that there are quite moving. Among those who were carried off to Damascus was a woman named Shushan Kamsaragan, who just a few years earlier in 703 had saved the lives of 300 Muslim soldiers who had arrived at her castle freezing to death after a winter battle. This is not the Saudi Peninsula. This is a place where it gets cold in the winter. So they had a January battle before which they were sleeping on snow. These guys were not in great shape for the fight. They lost. They had to escape across a frozen river. They lost a lot of their comrades who died in the icy water. And the ones who made it to Shushan's castle, to Shushan's fortress, were not in good shape. And so she did the Christian thing. She took them in, she warmed them up, she fed them, she gave them clothing. And then when the Armenian princes came looking for them in order to execute them, she said, no, not in my castle. And she made them all go away. She saved the lives of these unfortunate guys. And in 707, she died under torture in the prison in Harran. So again, a very strange twist of fate, different from Abdelaziz's, where he was forced to rebuild what he had destroyed. In her case, what she had built was destroyed around her, and she was destroyed with it. Her brother was in the process of building a church. And when she died, he made the dedication of the church a memorial service for her. And it seems that Yeria Katoligos may have presided at this opening ceremony. Another story from this time period is told in several different versions. Here is one of them. The southeastern Armenian province of Gokhtan is famous as the missionary ground where Mesrop Mashtots developed his realization of the necessity for an Armenian alphabet. And the prince of the area, named Khosrov, was one of the nobles who died in the Nakhichevan church burning. Or maybe he died in battle. The stories are different. His 4 or 5-year-old son, Vahan, now bereft of his father's protection, was among the prisoners carried off to Damascus. Now, to our ears, as with a 12-year-old being in the military and helping to destroy a city, a person of 4 or 5 is too young to participate in battle or any other political event. But we do have to bear in mind that training for the role that one would play later in life would begin in a noble family as early as the child could walk and speak. And there are stories of very small Mamigonian children carrying swords and doing military exercises and being built up physically to the point where they would be able to take over their family's military lineage. Marriageable age in this time was set at the start of puberty. And so the canons specify usually 11 as marriageable age for a boy and younger than that for a girl. So it's a different world. Children didn't have the luxury of waiting until they were 30 to grow up, or whatever, our current age, whatever the current age is, and whatever the family situation may allow. So that was not a possibility. Life expectancy was much shorter. And so you had to, get on with your life and make a difference and do the things that needed to be done rather earlier than one needs to these days. So in one version of the story, little Vahan goes off to Damascus, and he is adopted by a Muslim man who raises him there like a son. An alternate story has him ending up at the Caliph's court. In any case, he's trained in Islamic faith. He's set on a career path that looks very promising. He's contemplating a good marriage. And then the story goes, one day, Armenian prisoners were brought through the town, and he happened to see them and hear them. And according to this version of the story, something stirred in the heart of young Vahan, or as he was known to his Islamic family, Wahab. And he told his adopted father, or the Caliph, if we're following the story where he has a job at the court, that he needed to go back and find himself in Armenia. Or perhaps he was part of a prisoner exchange. However, whether it happened this way or that way, as things unfolded, he did actually return to Gochten, resumed his father's place as prince, relearned his mother tongue, married a Christian woman, raised a family, until 20 years later, so we're getting a little bit out of our time frame, but that's okay because we want to finish the story. A very much stricter Islamic regime captured him in another battle. And when it was discovered that he was an apostate from Islam, he was martyred. Now, Vahan, Wahab's sister, is known to us only as Khosrovitucht, which was her public name. In effect, she lost her brother twice, once as a child and once as an adult. And in his memory, she wrote a hymn that is still sung today, memorializing his extraordinary life and death. And I would like to play that for you. You may have heard it. Some of you may have sung it. As you can see, she was an accomplished musician, composer, singer, and she's one of two that we have works remaining from in Armenian that we know something about the person's history. And as you heard, while it is a sad hymn, there is also great upliftment in it and great celebration and solemnity as she recognizes what her brother had done in life. In other words, over the course of his life, Catholicos Yeria had to deal pastorally with events that were very traumatic for his flock. And he had to do this kind of care for them while not antagonizing those who were inflicting such things upon them. In addition, he had to make some kind of a statement about the church, its relationship to power, to the secular government, to the people. And so he rebuilt Divine Cathedral and the Catholicosal Palace compound, finding a way to take advantage of the kindly Abdelaziz's restoration plan. And we're told that the Catholicos made these structures more splendid than they had been before the city was destroyed. In other words, making a statement about the church's resilience and about its intention of staying as advocate for and representative of the people in the heart of Islamic rule over the region. The Catholicosal Palace is not far from the palace of the Muslim governor. The Armenian Christian presence, in other words, was shaken, but not cowed by the changing policies of the Islamic State. And the Catholicos was not going anywhere. In between all of these things, Yeria also found time to persuade the Caucasian Albanian church to keep their ancient ties with Armenian Christianity rather than to do as the Georgian church had done a century earlier and join the Chalcedonian Byzantine constellation of churches. When he died in 717, Catholicos Yeria had no idea, no way of knowing that a new era was just about to begin in Byzantium. It would take a little longer to arrive in the Islamic world. So before we move on into the life and work of Yeria's very illustrious, remarkable, well-known successor, we should take a look at what was happening in the Byzantine government as Yeria knew it, and we should investigate some of the issues that it was facing, because although there was no longer really an even division of power to the east and west of Armenia, Armenia was still influenced by what was going on both sides. As you can see, one of the reasons that Yeria, actually, let's go back to this for a minute, stayed away from closer relationships with the Byzantine Christian state was its instability. And while one might first incline to think that instability at the top of government is brought about by the egotistical and self-centered aspirations of powerful men, there was more to it than just that in this case, because Byzantium was undergoing a crisis of identity. The crisis is going to be protracted and painful. We're going to talk about it the entire session next time. And in an interesting way, this identity crisis had its roots in what we might call the mythology of the Byzantine Empire. And by mythology, I don't mean the untrue stories or the made-up tales of the empire. I mean quite the opposite to that. a state's mythology or a people's mythology or a family's mythology too. We may even have them for ourselves as individuals. Is the grand interpretation or the bigger narrative of things that the group uses in order to understand themselves and express themselves, describe their place in the world, their origins, the deepest qualities of their character. And there are many parts to such a mythology, or maybe I should use instead the word mythos. A mythos, a story by which people live, grows and changes over time as each new generation inherits it and uses it as a framework for their own life. They use it as a framework for how they educate their children, the aspirations they encourage their children to have. And we all have these frameworks, and sometimes we have multiple ones that are functioning at the same time. The things that tell us who we are, how we need to be because we are who we are, the things that we can do, the things that we do not do. In other words, a national mythos is very, very important and very powerful indeed. People live by it as individuals and families, but it's not just that. Policies are also made, and wars are fought, and territory and infrastructure is put together in a way that reflects the mythos, that reflects who we believe ourselves to be. And the Byzantine mythos had at least two sides to it. It was also very strong and enduring. On the one side, Byzantium saw itself as the new Roman Empire, the successor to the world dominance that had been old Rome. In other words, Byzantines took seriously their role as the heir of that very urbane, cosmopolitan, highly cultured, aesthetically advanced, deeply jurisprudence and justice based world. It was a world in which emperors had been gods, or at least sons of God. The Roman Empire had been the financial and trading and communications backbone of the known universe, and the Byzantines aspired to continue in that role. Their defeat by Muslim armies meant that for that mythos of Byzantium as the new Roman superpower to continue to be viable, there needed to be some serious financial and economic readjustments. Byzantium lost over half of its territory in the East to Islam, and lost territory was not just a humiliation, but it meant lost income. And more than lost income, it also meant changes in trade routes, and changed trade routes meant changes in the status of cities. When the trade goes somewhere else, the city that it used to go through declines to whatever degree. The city where it goes newly rises up. And so there is a lot of flux in this time period as people decide, where do we want to live? How do we follow our business needs? How can we get from here to there? What documentation do we, simply, very simple things like that. What documentation do we need to be able to get from here to there? And the imperial government, the central government, also had to adjust not only its expectations in terms of budget, but its network of tax collection and revenue dispersal. A new bureaucracy had to form. Old parts of the bureaucracy kind of faded away. And so while there is fluctuation in trade and business, there is also fluctuation in the rise and fall of bureaucrats, in changes in government offices, and so on. This is all very unsettling, and people are not often happy with this kind of transition. And so at the start of the 8th century, as we can see here, strong man after strong man tried to prove his ability to control all of this change, and also to prove by his success at doing this that divine favor was with him, that his ideas and his ways, which at least in his own mind were very different from those of his predecessor, were good and right and effective and what the country needed at this point in time. And considering how different people's ideas can be about these things, and how strongly people can group themselves behind someone who they see rising to power, it's really not surprising at all that all but one of these emperors who tried to gain a permanent foothold in power just during Katolikos Yeria's lifetime died a violent death, either at the hands of their own troops or those of their successor. The one exception to this was the last emperor, Theodosius III. He was kind of an accidental emperor anyway. He had never planned to be emperor. His troops elevated him to imperial rank. And when he saw that he was indeed not going to be able to control this extremely complicated and volatile situation, and when he realized that there was a much stronger candidate for the position, he negotiated with that candidate for a peaceful transition of power that meant that he himself would be given the opportunity to abdicate, an opportunity that he took, and become a monk. So this is quite the midlife change of career. And it seems possible that he went on as a monk, and his son was allowed to join him in his monastery. When he became a monk, he went on to become also the Bishop of Ephesus. Now, it's not 100% certain that that's the case for him, but he at least lived to tell the tale. He did what was right in terms of his understanding of what would be best for the country, for the empire. And he did not cost more people their lives than necessary. And it's with his successor that we'll spend a good bit of time next time. But it's not just the financial, imperial, trade backbone of the universe kind of mythos that the Byzantines had. Together with it, kind of intertwined with it, was an equally strong, morally uplifting Christian mythological framework. The emperor, in addition to being the Son of God in the old sense, was truly the vicar of Christ, God's Son on earth. And he knew that he was tasked, whether or not he was able to accomplish this, with making his dominion a depiction of the kingdom of God on earth. And he was tasked with spreading that morally, culturally superior polity as far as possible. Byzantines saw themselves as the new chosen people. They saw themselves in the Israelites of old who were guarded and guided by the hand of the Almighty himself, who had a special relationship with him. Now, they're not the only people to live by this Christian set of obligations and privileges, but the Byzantines are the biggest group to do so, surely. And this second mythos, this second sacred story of their identity and their obligations and their privileges in the world was now challenged. By their defeat at the hands of Islam. In addition to financial and economic and political changes then, Byzantine beliefs, ideas, tolerances were also in a state of change and adjustment. And they really had to think, what does it mean? What does it mean that Christian Byzantium, the world's divinely favored superpower and superior power, has been defeated by Islam, in their view, an upstart and inferior religion? And Christian Byzantium has been divested of large parts of its property. This shook people's world. How could this be? And the soul searching that Byzantines were going through was deep and it was sincere. How could this have happened? How could we lose? God has abandoned his people as they saw it. Why? And as they searched the stories of the Israelites in the Old Testament, in the histories, in the prophets, Byzantine religious thinkers reached what was to them the obvious conclusion. After all, in the Old Testament, God had turned his back on the Israelites when they had turned their back on God. Something was amiss, seriously amiss, in the relationship between the Byzantine Christians and their God. And so spiritual renewal, a cleansing from wrongdoing and wrong thinking, they were positive, had to be the starting point for any change that might come about in Byzantium's fortunes. And so then the question becomes, well, what do we need to change? What needs to be cleansed? What is the root from which their unfaithfulness, their spiritual shortcomings had grown? Well, there are the obvious things. And so people knew there was a need to sweep away immoral behaviors unpleasing to God. But people also felt that part of the reason why their behavior had deteriorated was because they had in fact been lax in keeping the faith, both its content and its expression. And so in this time period, there is a renewed urgency to define and then to maintain and then to create a greater Christian unity around right faith, faith pleasing to God. And so Byzantines were very harsh in regard to deviant habits or expressions of faith in this time period that were endangering the Christian world's ability to make a pure sacrifice of faith and praise to God. And so there's a council that happens in 692. It has two names. It's called the Quinisext Council, which means the 5th/6th council. And it's also called the Council in Trullo because of the shape of the hall at the royal palace in which it was held. And when you read the canons of that council, there are several that look suspiciously anti-Armenian. They have to do with things like condemning the practice of not adding water to one's communion wine. The only people who do that are Armenians. It deals with the terrible thing of blessing cooked meat in church. What is that about? Armenians don't bless cooked meat in church. What are they talking about? Well, they're thinking about Madach, most probably. And so on. There are at least 4 of these things, plus some other interesting ones that may actually have an Armenian connection. And when reading these things in the 21st century, we look at them and go, what are you so concerned about? I mean, what is your problem? Why should we be so concerned with what Armenians are doing off in their end of the empire? It's not even the empire anymore. It was this underlying urgency that we should all stand together. We should all be the same. We should all believe the same. We should all worship the same. We should, because we want to make this unified offering to God. But there's something else interesting about this council. The council ordained that this is no longer possible. What you see are 2 symbolic depictions of Christ. 3, actually, if you're looking at it. Covert depictions of Christ, if you like. The Christian fish, the anchor, and the first 2 letters in Greek of Christ's name. Letters that appear on tombstones in the catacombs. Again, there's nothing specifically in this depiction, unless you know, to say that this is a Christian tomb. You have the birds, the eternal soul, you have the mourning people, and so on. Christ has also been portrayed theologically as a lamb, perhaps, as in this mosaic, a lamb with a strangely human face and a halo. Or this one. Again, there is no depiction of Christ per se. There's a depiction of what Christ stands for, what he means, what one of the symbols for him was in Scripture as the Lamb of God, the sacrifice. Christ could also be found depicted. Here's another lamb. You see the lamb standing on the rock at the bottom? I kind of like that one. As the Good Shepherd. Very beloved depiction of Christ. The problem with it was that it was very hard to tell whether you were looking at Christ. I suppose this is not a problem in the beginning, it's actually an advantage. Whether you're looking at Christ or whether you're looking at one of the pagan deities. Is this young man with a lamb around his shoulders Christ, or is it someone else? What about this one? These were Christian symbols that allowed Christ to be looked upon as an esoteric or an unembodied divine idea, not as the God-man. And so the council in Trullo put an end to this kind of depiction, confirming that Christ is neither an idea, nor a symbol, nor an unembodied thing, but the reality of God in flesh. And so it is not appropriate to depict him under the guise of anything other than his own image in human form. Something like this, for example, an icon of the Holy Face, whose prototype was supposed to have been Christ himself. This is a copy of it from a chapel in the Vatican. And here is another version of it from the Church of St. Bartholomew of the Armenians in Genoa. This is acceptable. The idea is not new that there could be depictions of Christ. Oh, I like this one for its frame. This icon of Christ, very famous one from the Sinai, is from the 6th century, 100 years before Trullo. So it's not that the depictions of Christ were unknown, it's just that now they become the mainstream. There is this emphasis not just on the confession of faith and the way that we do liturgy and the things that we don't do during liturgy, but there is also this strong emphasis on how we view Christ as being extremely important as part of our unified Christian front, part of the unified worship that we are going to show to God. Well, the implications of this ruling, in combination with other political forces, created the situation that we're going to discuss in great detail next time, as this thinking about the reality of Christ bleeds over into the depictions of Christ, their role, their function. It's an issue which, although it seems strange to our mind, caused the rise and fall of emperors, bloodshed, and over 100 years of spiritual angst, great fervor. It's a question to which the Armenians made a contribution that, in my opinion, and you can decide next week whether you agree with me or not, that was pure genius, to say nothing of being totally in harmony with the Armenians' own national mythos. How the Armenians will manage to take a stand on this question without taking a stand on this question, how they will manage to turn this whole contentious debate into something that unifies Armenians in a way that it didn't for over 100 years unify Byzantium, is really a fascinating story. And so I look forward to having a chance to share that with you next time we meet.